Thank you so much for coming, and welcome to your first icebreaker. You figured out how to get here. So thank you so much. I know it was a little bit confusing, but I really appreciate you dedicating yourself to this event. And thank you also for those joining us online. So we'll just get started. Take your time getting dinner and settling in, but I'm just going to move this along and get us started. So before we begin, actually, we'll do a land acknowledgement. So we wish to acknowledge the land on which the Gairdner Foundation operates, commonly known as Toronto. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples from across Turtle Island. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. As we know, many of you are joining us from maybe beyond Toronto and even Canada. We encourage you to learn more about the land on which you live, work, and play at nativeland.ca. So we're very excited for you to be here at tonight's workshop, which would not be possible without our presenting sponsors, the Government of Canada, CIHR, and TELUS Health, as well as our partners, RCI Science and Science Up First. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the Gairdner Foundation. Gairdner Foundation celebrates and recognizes scientific excellence through the annual Canada Gairdner Awards. In the last 65 years, 411 awards have been presented to laureates from over 40 countries, and 96 of those have gone on to receive the Nobel Prize. But beyond the awards, we host various outreach events to inspire the next generation of researchers and facilitate open scientific discourse to better educate the public, understand the problems we face, and work together to find solutions, which is why we're here today. So to set the stage for us is astrophysicist, folklorist, and science communicator, Dr. Moya McTeer. Moya grew up in a log cabin in rural Pennsylvania without running water or TV, which meant she had plenty of time to focus on her studies. Hard work and a lot of luck took Moya to Harvard, where she was the first person in the school's long history double major in both astrophysics and folklore. After graduating, Moya moved to New York to earn her PhD in astrophysics at Columbia University. Moya officially became a Doctor of the Universe in 2021 as the first Black woman to graduate from Columbia's astronomy PhD program and started pursuing science communication full-time. In her career, Moya has already given hundreds of talks about science around the world to help design exhibits for the New York Hall of Science and consulted with companies like Disney and PBS on scientific themes in their project. She has reached thousands through interviews on hit podcasts and media channels. Moya can also be found co-hosting Fate and Fabled, a mythology show for PBS Digital Studios, as well as hosting her own podcasts, Exolore, about fictional world building through a science lens, and Pale Blue Pod, which is about astronomy for people who are afraid of the cosmos. Moya's debut book, The Milky Way, an autobiography of our galaxy, was released in 2022 to critical acclaim and was named one of Publishers Weekly's best books of 2022. Moya's mission is to help people understand the world around us better through science and is eager to do that across as many platforms as possible. Please help me welcome Dr. McTeer to kick off the workshop.
Thank you. What a self-indulgent bio I wrote. Thank you for reading it all. I'm going to move around a little bit because I learned how to talk in front of a crowd from my mom, who always sat on a table while she did it. Hello, everyone. How you doing? Good. All right. We have some eating mouths. That's okay. I'm Dr. Moya McTeer. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a professional, full-time, freelance science communicator. I've been doing that full-time for almost 3 years now, but I have been communicating science for almost a decade. And if I'm being honest with myself, I was a little know-it-all brat. So I definitely was explaining science before then too. I would love to know a bit more about you and your relationships to science and science communication and education. So by show of hands, since many of you are eating, how many people here work as an educator right now? Awesome. Keep your hands up if you are an educator in a formal setting, like a school. All right, I saw some hands go down. Awesome. You can put your hands down. I also see some younger people in the audience who might not be working professionally right now, but by show of hands, how many of you would like to be working as educators one day? Cool. Awesome. All right. Well, educators, future educators, it's nice to meet you. Let's talk about the theme of the evening, which is science literacy. So FYI, just some info for you. I don't know if these slides are going to be shared, but everything you see in yellow is a hyperlink, and at the end of my presentation, there will be a QR code that will take you to a PDF of this presentation, so you can access those links. This one takes you to an article about a Pew Research Center poll about science literacy, so that's the type of stuff you can expect from these links. The term science literacy, let's talk about it. It was popularized as a term in the early 1900s, but itself was born out of a kind of young movement. That movement was people, for the first time in Europe at least, interested in educating someone who was not a wealthy land-owning white man. What a concept. And so back then, when they started the science literacy movement, they were really interested in teaching people science facts. They thought if we can just get people to know more science, then we'll have an informed populace. They'll be able to make better decisions. Voting wasn't necessarily a thing for all of the places back then, but they wanted to have a group of people in their society who understood how the world worked so that they could help society progress forward. And for a long time, we tested science literacy by giving people tests about science. We would give them a multiple choice test full of science questions without any context, without any relevance to their lives, and then we would take their responses to that test as some sort of measurement of how scientifically literate we were. But that's all assuming that the whole breadth of science literacy is based on knowing science facts. But as I'm sure many of the people in this audience know from their experience as educators, and as maybe the title of this workshop can tell us, facts are not enough. And we know that because if you just shout science facts into a person's face, there's no guarantee they're going to listen to you. We all remember the beginning of the pandemic, right? Where people heard it was an airborne virus, but that didn't really change many people's behavior. There's also no guarantee that they're going to internalize and retain that information for later. Like they might not remember it if you're just giving them an isolated factoid without embedding it in something else that they can really grab hold of. The other reason that science literacy does not end with giving people science facts is because it just can't. Knowing science facts does not actually make you better at making decisions. It does not make you better at being an informed member of society. There's more to it than that. So I think of science literacy as a more complicated web. Knowing science facts, definitely a part of it, but maybe an even bigger part of it is knowing how science gets done. We can tell people that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. We can tell them that the earth revolves around the sun, but if they don't know how the scientists learned that information, why would they trust us? There are so many examples of science learning something, putting out a big flashy result in a news piece. And then a few months later, after we've gathered more information, our knowledge shifts. We adapt to new data. And when we change that big flashy result in the next headline, people actually take that as an example of science not working. People think that is a reason to not trust science, when in fact, it's a sign of science working exactly how it's supposed to. So we need to get people to know how science gets done. They need to know how long scientists spend double checking their work and trying to get other people to prove it wrong. Otherwise, they will not trust the work we do. Science literacy is also knowing how the science impacts your life. This could be as small as knowing conceptually the physics of condensation, so that if your windshield fogs up, you can tell whether you should put hot or cold air blowing onto it. It could also be as big as all of the nuanced, complicated physics that goes into climate change, so that we can discuss the climate crisis. This is a really big one, and we need to teach people how they can make those connections. It's also about how others interpret science. There's a lot of really interesting psychology wrapped up in this. One of these links will take you to a poll, a science literacy poll. And if you go down into the tiny text below it, you'll see a footnote about an experiment that they ran on a social poll in 2012, where they were asking science questions. One of the questions, or some people in the group were asked, how long does it take the Earth to go around the sun? And then other people in the group were asked, according to astronomers, how long does it take the Earth to go around the sun? And just adding that little prefix increased the correct response rate from about 40% to about 60%. So clearly, there's something in here about how we think other people think about science. So we need to get people thinking about that. And related is how science gets portrayed in the media. We live in an age of the internet. There's a lot of digital mis and disinformation out there. And to be a scientifically literate person, you need to be able to comb through all of that data, tell what's good, tell what isn't. And of course, all of these have subcategories too. Like knowing how science gets done means knowing how to ask a good question and how to put together a process for figuring out what the answer to that question might be. You need to be willing to update your worldview once you have new information. This is what scientists are really good at, and what I want everyone in the public to be really good at. But in order to update your worldview with new information, you should probably base it on accurate information, which means you need to be able to tell reliable sources of information from unreliable. And if you haven't been trained in doing literature reviews or doing your own research, a Google search is not research, then that's really hard to do. So as communicators, as educators, it is our responsibility to get people thinking about this entire web of science literacy. And I'm sure this isn't exhaustive. I'm sure you can think of other things that should go on this graphic. But that web of science literacy is the reason that I have made it my personal mission as a science communicator to help people trust science and the people who do it. I keep pointing it at the wrong thing, I'm sorry. But also to understand, recognize, and appreciate the science in their everyday lives, the science that they interact with all the time, even if they don't realize it. I am not trying to get people to be scientists. I think I came to this mission because I was never interested in working with children. I only wanted to work with adults, so I knew I wasn't going to get them to become scientists one day. I just wanted to help them vote better, maybe. But this has been my mission for the last 7 or so years. And as I've gone through my work trying to accomplish that goal, I have come up against the same barriers to science literacy over and over again. I'm going to talk to you about some of them. Again, not an exhaustive list, and I encourage you to think of other barriers that I didn't get to put on this one little slide. So the first is lack of access, and this means a lot of things. This could be access to physical materials, to actual tools and software that you need in order to know about science. So like the internet. Not everyone has access to high-speed internet. Not everyone has access to books. Not everyone has access to a good teacher that cares about them and will work with their particular learning style. But this is also about accessibility, which I'm sure Ainsley is going to be talking about later. You know, if you have a disability, if you can't see the screen, and someone's not making exceptions or accommodations for you, you cannot access the science in order to be scientifically literate. There are a lot of different ways that lack of access impacts people. Sometimes the barrier is coming from inside the house. Sometimes it's the very person we're trying to reach who is blocking us and our scientific lessons. And that is because, you know, that stereotypical kid in high school geometry class who wants to know, when am I ever going to use the Pythagorean theorem? Those kids grow up and they still don't think they need to know the Pythagorean theorem. They still don't understand how it's going to be useful in their everyday lives. And so there are ways to get around this, but we have to know that this is a potential barrier. Many people don't think that science is relevant to them. But we all know here that science is relevant to everyone, right? Like, I am speaking into a microphone because of science. Many of you were able to get here on airplanes because of science. Cars because of science. You knew what clothes to wear because we have meteorologists who tell you what the weather is going to be like. Science is everywhere, so it's always relevant. There's also a lack of role models. I almost didn't become a scientist. I didn't meet my first Black woman scientist until I was a junior in college. And if my mom hadn't pushed me to study a science because she was an English professor and made no money, then I probably would not be standing here in front of you today. And finally, bias. This is bias like prejudice. There are certain groups of people who are systemically kept from accessing certain resources, but also like psychological bias, like confirmation bias. Some people, humans, have a tendency to be biased towards what they already believe, and they will only accept new information if it confirms what they already think is true. So there's a lot of different biases that we have to reckon with. Will you give me a time call? Cool, thanks. I have learned different ways to knock down some of those barriers, and hint, hint, it starts with community. Community is a really great way to knock down barriers to access, and you can do this in a couple of ways. I recommend doing both. You can tap into existing communities, or you can build out communities to make them bigger, wider reaching, and more efficient. So in order to tap into a community, you must first earn their trust. Don't go in guns a-blazing, thinking that you have all the answers like a bull in a china shop. Instead, approach it like you are a dinner guest. And you have, of course, brought your own dish because you're not rude, but you're also very excited to try other people's dishes at the dinner party. So when you're trying to tap into a community, listen first. Learn what they have to teach you before you try teaching them anything, because that is the way to earn their respect and trust. Meet them where they are. I'm sure this is not new advice to any of you, but I mean both mentally and physically. Figure out what they know, what they don't know, and what you want them to know, and then plan from there, whatever your lesson is going to be. But also physically, meet them where they are. Go to their schools, go to their parks, go to their libraries. One of my favorite science communication endeavors is the Micro Museum in New York. Has anyone here heard of micro museums? Hell yeah, Carrie. I'm sorry. They are these 6-foot-tall small museums. They started out being about mollusks, and they put these museums in places where people in the community already go. Their library, their hospital, their CVS. And that way people don't have to opt in to a science experience, which are often expensive and or time intensive, but they just get science put in their everyday lives, and that's beautiful. Also, one way to fight against that perceived irrelevance barrier is to figure out what their daily lives are like. And then once you know, you can tie science lessons into their everyday activities. Also, share diverse stories from people within the community or people who that community respect and look up to. In order to build out the communities, pull together resources. If you know of 2 schools that are struggling in the same state or the same region, connect the people in charge of those schools. Grow their resources, grow their reach. Create opportunities for peer teaching, because anytime a person explains science to someone else, they learn it better. It gets reinforced in their brain. And help them establish support networks. Establish networks of peers who understand what your experiences are and can help you through the tough times, because in science, in life, there are always going to be tough times. As I try to break down barriers, there are a few tools that I really love to use each time. The first is humor. People are more responsive, they're more primed to learn something when they're having a good time, when they're happy. Studies have shown that when you're laughing, you are more likely to remember a piece of information that is shared with you. I use a lot of storytelling. Even when I'm giving people science facts, I put it in a narrative. There's a beginning, middle, and end. There are characters. There's a plot. So even if people don't remember the details of the facts, they remember the overall concepts. On that note, I often use a lot of fiction and creativity in my work. I touch on cultural touch points, but not cringy ones. So make sure that it's a cultural touch point that the group you're engaging actually likes. Beyonce, usually a good bet. There was another one that is my lived experiences, because it's important to humanize scientists. We are people too. We're just people who love to be in labs. And I have used those tools to connect with and relate to different audiences that are often forgotten by science communicators. I've been very fortunate to work with a lot of artists and creatives, and one of my favorite ways to do that is to turn my science into something more fictional. So I wrote a book about the Milky Way galaxy from the anthropomorphized galaxy's point of view. And that way people who don't consider themselves science-y can engage with the material and still get something out of it. I host a podcast that's about space for people who are afraid of space, and I do that by making it seem less weird, less foreign, less unfamiliar. I end every episode with, remember, you are space, because it's not something that is separate and distant from us, it's something we're already a part of. Oh, no. I'll go back. I treat folklore as an early type of science. The myths that ancient cultures around the world were telling for thousands of years, they weren't all just made up. Many of them were based on observation, so they were early science. And I also make episodes of my podcast that try to build safe homes for members of groups that have often been left on the margins or harmed. One of them was called the World of Blind Nomads. Serendipitously, one of the guests is here. Mahadeo is here. All of the guests were blind, and the goal for that episode was to imagine a world where sight wasn't the default, and so it was a world really built by blind people for blind people, where actually the concept of blindness doesn't really exist because sight isn't the default. So those are the ways that I like to engage different communities. I'm going to stop talking now and let you hear from other people who have a lot of experience engaging really, really different communities. So thank you so much. And now, oh yeah, cool. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So now we're going to hear from 4 different scholars, academics, communicators, about the communities they engage. And up first is Carrie Boyce, who is the Executive Director of RCI Science and the co-founder of Science is a Drag. So let's give Carrie a hand.
Hi everyone, how you doing? So I'm here tonight to talk about the world's first all science-themed drag show. If you haven't heard about it before, where have you been? This is where we take scientists and we dress them in drag, often for the first time, and train them to share research with the public in queer-friendly spaces. Is a community-driven event created to challenge cis-heteronormative stereotypes in STEM and provide a safe and empowering opportunity for the 2S LGBTQIA+ community and its allies to engage with science. Now, despite often performing in drag for the first time, our performers serve drama and science in equal measure, whether that's turning live DNA extractions into burlesque performances, highlighting the climate crisis with lip syncs and fiery costume reveals. They might be challenging people's perceptions of bees using Pictionary, or teaching us the correct techniques for flossing using feather boas. Whether it's through stand-up comedy, lip syncs, dance demos, something else entirely, our performers share research in truly unforgettable ways. And I think that's a really novel thing that's happening here, is that we are really leaning into a fun and unexpected way of communicating science. Just a quick side note that if you can do the splits, I will lose my mind. That's me on the roller coaster at the edge, just overjoyed. But there might be a few of you in the audience tonight or watching from home wondering why the need. And I'm going to pose a question to you all. If you're watching from home, type in the live chat. If you're here, raise a hand. But I'm curious, has anyone ever felt excluded from science in their life for one reason or another? Okay, few enough hands. Yeah, so science is for everyone. Or at least it should be. I see it on enough campaigns, enough tote bags, science is for everyone. I think the reality is that for many, science remains an unwelcoming space that is entrenched in the echoes of white supremacy and cis heteronormativity. Now, despite the presumed objectivity and universality of STEM, queer people in particular continue to face a multitude of biases in STEM education, research, and the workplace. If you're curious to read the receipts, that's a whole other presentation I don't have time for tonight, but RCI Science recently released a report over the summer with the Aspen Institute Science and Society program, summarizing a lot of this, the kind of data that exists. You can follow the QR code or shoot me an email. Let's have a cathartic vent about that another time. But the point is that science remains very straight, and this has huge ramifications for the breadth, quality, impact of science discovery, and excludes billions of people. from around the world from participating in science because of how they dress, look, speak, or love. And so, like all good revolutions, Science is a Drag was born out of frustration. Pride, after all, is a protest. Quite a number of people kind of asked me how this kind of idea came to be. It's really the brainchild of Sam, Dr. Samantha Yamin. You might know her as Science Sam on social media, and her friends Geeth and Sean, who were all PhD candidates at the time, at a RuPaul's Drag Race viewing party, lamenting how they'd each been told that they were too loud, too bubbly, or too feminine for science, which is wild because science doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is shaped by the people who do it, and those people are shaped by the communities in which they live. And so they kind of had this moment where they wondered why they couldn't marry these two things that they love and adore, science and drag. And Sam brought the idea to me, and the rest, as they say, is history. Now, in terms of how we do it, what we do, support is really critical. We spend many hours on the science communication training component of our shows to find our performers' stories and their hooks. But the novel piece here is also on the drag mentorship side, where we figure out personas and costumes and performances and so on. And then somewhere on this journey, there's this really beautiful moment where these two facets kind of align and we get a sense of what the show's going to look like. But in terms of where, we're very intentional in working with proactively LGBTQ plus friendly spaces to foster a safe environment for our performers and for our audiences. And we do keep accessibility in mind as far as possible, but I think Ainsley's going to share a little bit more about that in a moment. And in terms of the who we present, we are very intentional about who we put on stage. We try to be intersectional as far as possible, acknowledging that no one show can represent all things to all people at any given time. But we try to be very thoughtful about the different kinds of diversity and inclusivity we're presenting on stage. And we also have a very loose definition of drag for anyone who's a big drag fan out there. Gatekeeping is no fun, and we want everyone to kind of come and play in our little sandbox. In terms of where we're seeing impact, I think that's the science engagement piece. That's a really novel approach to sharing science through such a joyful medium that provides a safe space for learning without fear of judgment. I mentioned that many of our performers are doing this for the first time, performing in drag for the first time. Doing any sort of public speaking, if you've had the experience, can be quite intimidating. Doing that in drag is a whole other thing entirely. And this is where the safety piece maybe gets a little bit nuanced because it goes beyond the physical space. I think with this interaction, we create this sort of social agreement, the social understanding of trust where with our performers leading with their vulnerability, they create this space where the audience and performers are more on a level playing field, and our audiences can in turn be vulnerable, can ask questions, and can engage with something new. And that's quite different to any other initiatives I've been involved with in the past. We also create a space for our performers to embrace all facets of their identity. That they may otherwise feel a need to kind of suppress or hide for safety or success at work. And then this authenticity, for want of a better word, is a key component of trust, which I think is of increasing importance in the disinformation age. And I think Christiane is going to speak to more on that in a moment. And I just wanted to share a couple of bits of feedback. I really love that someone highlighted that attending the show reminded them they have community in both worlds, both science and in the sort of queer space, and that those two things never needed to be mutually exclusive. And a performer of ours realizing that they could be the role model they never had growing up and kind of mentor the next generation of scientists or perhaps queer performers coming up, which I think is really special. And then by creating a safe space for discussions about science that center the perspectives of the 2S LGBTQIA plus people, we foster a supportive community, and then we can mobilize change that we really need to see in STEM and beyond. And we're really working to grow that community as well. We're inviting other queer groups into our space. And we recently invited a local photography club to come out to our last show. And we're always on the lookout for opportunities for collaboration and alignment where we can really lift each other up and join one larger community. By the numbers, I think one of the reasons I love this show so much is we're actually reaching beyond the already science-aware, science-engaged audience. You know, so many times when we have science festivals, we're really preaching to the choir in many ways. But but well over half of our audience report that they'd never attended a science-themed event in the past, and that they wouldn't have come to our show if it wasn't for the drag component. Almost 90% report feeling more comfortable at Science is a Drag than typical science events, and they all want to come back for more. I think the thing that's really surprised us is that demand is insanely high for something that is not the Eras Tour. But like Taylor Swift's Eras Tour, I think it's the emotional impact of engaging with science at our shows that hits a little bit different, as audience members and performers alike connect different parts of their identities together and embrace who they are fully. I don't have time to talk about exciting things in the press, but it's on the website, scienceisadrag.com, if you're curious. Just wanted to share that, like, in terms of next steps, we're just working on spreading the word and really trying to call out science to call us in. And the team and I are considering how to thoughtfully scale the project while remaining true to our intersectional values and the quality of the science communication. And I just kind of want to wrap up by saying that Science is a Drag isn't just a queer show for queer people. It is a very queer show, but it's not exclusively for that. I think the beauty of drag is that it's so loud and sparkly and in your face, that whether or not you consider yourself a science person, you really can't help but stop and pay attention. And with an increase in hateful discourse and violence against queer communities, which I'm saddened to say I think we're only going to see an increase of in the next little while, Science is a Drag really is a sanctuary rooted in the joy of discovering science through the powerful art of drag. And I think when loud voices decry critical thinking and the world feels like a dumpster fire, it's art, creativity, and good humor that are going to pave the way to healing and inclusion. We're here to take up space. We aren't going anywhere. And I really love this one. As one performer put it, science can embrace us as much as we embrace it. And that's really all I have to say. Just more egregious pictures because I think this show's so visual and so beautiful. I wanted to give you a little taste. If you have questions and comments and things we don't get to talk tonight, visit scienceisadrag.com. Follow us on Instagram at scienceisadrag. And I think I have to pose my challenge question, which we'll get to in a moment. But my question is, how do we facilitate a safe environment? And that goes beyond physical spaces and that goes beyond the queer community. How do we facilitate safe environment, inclusive space for learning and discovery? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carrie. So Carrie just asked you a question, but let's also keep in mind that there's a chance later to ask everyone on the panel questions. So think of those as we get ready to hear from our next speaker, who is Ainsley Latour, the co-founder of Idea STEM. So let's give Ainsley a round of applause.
Thank you, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you tonight and all of you who are joining us online as well. Thank you so much. So as Moya so generously offered, my name is Ainsley. I am the co-founder and the president of a fairly new organization in Canada, actually, called Idea STEM, which by the name, as it suggests, says we have a focus on equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility inside science spaces. And in particular, one of the things that we do really well is we support people in their journeys to strengthen the connection between persons with disabilities and STEM spaces, and keeping in mind that persons with disabilities belong to a number of other equity-deserving communities as well, and that intersectionality piece is extremely important in what we do. And so we've done some amazing work with some of the people on the panel, and we're looking forward to just sharing some messages about how to strengthen and build confidence in people with disabilities that they can do science and they can be engaged, and that their opinion, their participation in science spaces, in fact, matters very much. Thank you. So, as it's been previously mentioned in this panel, when you're doing science communication, it's useful to know something about the group that you are engaging with in conversation. And it's not just a one-way conversation. You are going to learn as much about those people that you're communicating with as they might learn about science. And that reciprocal relationship and that dialogue is extremely important. But to facilitate that dialogue, it is really helpful to know something about the group that you are dialoguing with. And so it's not really a test, it's maybe a bit of a quiz if you want, a couple of questions about people with disabilities in science, just to see how much you might know or how much you might not know. And if you don't know any of the answers, please just be very kind to yourself and just think about why, and sort of, if you are here and you're a lover of science, just enlighten your curiosity about why maybe you don't know some of the responses to the questions that I'm going to offer. So one is, first, can you name a scientist with a disability, either that's living now or was living in the past, who was not Stephen Hawking, Albert Einstein, or Temple Grandin? So let's give, if people can just think about it amongst themselves, you may not have known that Charles Darwin was probably neurodivergent, that there is a professor at St. Mary's University in Halifax who is deaf and uses a sign language interpreter. And there are many other examples of scientists with disabilities across Canada, although many of us are not out about our disabilities because the stigma is very significant, especially in colleges and universities. I was probably in graduate school or postgraduate diploma program before I finally met someone else in science who had a disability. And that person ends up being my husband, and who is here today. And I have yet to meet anyone else with a disability who practices in a regulatory allied healthcare profession that I'm in. So I practice right now casually at a hospital before my mat leave in cancer and genetic diagnostics, and there is nobody else that I've ever met as a medical laboratory technologist in genetics who has a disability. It is very hard to remain in that field as someone with a disability. So next question, can you make a document accessible to someone who's using text-to-speech software or a screen reader? And that is, in fact, a significant body of skill and knowledge. We have science communication events, people register online. Some of you might turn to social media as channels to counter disinformation and misinformation about science. Some of you might advertise, do podcasts, whatever. There's lots of ways to communicate science and lots of different channels we can use. But if you are just posting a lovely image file with some text on it and some great background, but it's an image file, then someone with a screen reader is probably not going to get anything other than graphic, and they're going to miss all the information that you have to offer. So if you've never interacted with a screen reader, and if you don't know how to make your stuff accessible, why? Why don't you know? We'll talk about that in a second. Can someone use a microscope if they're blind? The answer is yes, because for one thing, most people who are deaf actually have residual sight that they can use. And second, using a microscope is not just about the image that is under the microscope that you're viewing. Next question, do you know where to source accessible science manipulatives or accessible equipment? Laboratories aren't accessible to people with wheelchairs, for example. Everything is located up high, so if you're using a wheelchair, how are you going to reach things? If you want to see a microscope and you can't manipulate things with your hands, how is that going to work for you? So there are places to get accessible science equipment or to engineer accessible science equipment, but most people don't know where to find them. And it is, in fact, a very small body of knowledge that very few people have. And finally, do you know how the perceptions of disability differ across different cultures and different communities? They, in fact, do. If your experience as a Black person with a disability is very different than somebody who has very similar characteristics but has fair skin and is of maybe European descent. So if you don't know the answers to these questions, let's just think about why for a second. And again, be very gentle with yourself when we consider this. Maybe you've never met anyone with a disability before in science. That's probably very likely. Maybe you don't have friends with disabilities that you socialize with regularly, particularly in a professional context. You've never thought about it. No one's ever talked to you or read you any stories about any scientists with disabilities. And maybe you really just didn't think people with disabilities were interested or capable or should even need to do or learn science. And that is, in fact, a very real bias that a lot of people have, and I can tell you that because I have colleagues as a teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing who believe their students should be focusing on speech and language and other things that are much more important to them than science, and that is in fact an unconscious bias that is not true. So if you don't know, it's really important just to think about why you don't know. And while we at IdeaSTEM can teach you how to build the knowledge and skills to make your science communications accessible, the one thing that is harder for us to do is to change your attitude. And the way you can do that is by asking yourself some of these questions, asking why you don't know. Ask yourself 5 times, because the first couple of responses will be habitual, and then eventually you will start to be able to create change within yourself, which will create more accessibility. So on the screen, there is an image of Dr. Wanda Diaz. She is, in fact, an amazing astronomer. Moya could probably tell you a little bit about her as well. So on the screen, she's pictured sort of in 2 places. There are 2 planets in the background and 2 images of her, one with her wearing headphones, and it looks like she's maybe feeling something with her hand, and another one where she's giving a TED Talk and she has her red cane with her. Her hair is black and short and a little bit curly and wavy, and she looks to be brown, potentially of Mexican or Caribbean descent, I'm not sure. And there's another image on the screen where there's maybe a satellite or something showing, and then her hand is on some sort of tactile device. So she is in fact an astronomer who is blind, and she almost dropped out of science despite her amazing passion for studying the stars, because she didn't have a way to study the stars when she lost her sight as an undergraduate student. At one point, there was somebody who said, hey, listen to this. I'm going to show you some sonification. So sonification is using different pitches, non-speech sounds, to represent data, in this case, astronomical data. And at that point, she was like, oh, maybe I could do this. And so she started testing out sonification and found out when she tested it with fully sighted astronomers, they actually learned more about their data than they had been able to get from their data just with vision alone. And so she has completely transformed the way that she does science, with the way that she does astronomy and what we know about astronomy, and really had a huge impact. And that would not have been possible if her supervisor had not taken her on. So when she applied to NASA to do an internship as an undergraduate student, she had taken 6 years to do her undergraduate degree. She had poor marks, she'd failed courses, she'd repeated them, and this person at NASA took her on. And that person's name is Bobby. So there's a couple of quotes on the screen. So Bobby taking me on was really an act of trust. I didn't have the required grades or experience, and I felt like the other students were talking in tongues. I grabbed his hand and told him I didn't know anything, and he just said, I'm not worried. He was confident, and he wanted to instill confidence in Dr. Wanda Diaz that she could be a scientist, and he was willing to go with her on the journey and figure out how to make it happen. They weren't focused on accommodations. They weren't focused on what the person couldn't do. They were focused on interest and passion, and that's what we need to do. Accommodations, and I won't speak too much about this, are disrespectful. They're patronizing, they're dehumanizing, and they're terrible. And when we talk about human rights legislation and the AODA in Ontario, really we're talking about the floor, the very bare minimum for people with accessibility needs. And systems are allowed to be biased as well. And in fact, whoever had to use the accommodation system was definitely not the person to write it, because I can tell you in the employment setting, outside of very structured lectures, for example, they don't work. So it's not the way to think about accessibility and inclusion with accommodations. It's more about strengthening connections with people, getting them to trust you, and then going bravely with them to figure out how to make it work. Because we don't know, because there's not a lot of history of people with disabilities doing science. So that is what I have. So the slides I've made auditory, all of the content that is visual. The slides mostly were just text-based with black text, a white background, and purple plum headings, and the Idea STEM logo. Thank you. Oh, and a challenge question. So my challenge question, again, addressing inclusion in science for all people, is what are your assumptions about what science is, about who does science, about how science is done, that really limit the opportunities for people from equity-deserving communities to be part of the conversation? Thank you.
Thank you. Awesome. We are going to hear from Mathia Alatini next. Mathia is the Chief Strategist at GSD Strategies and the Board Chair for One Yukon, an Indigenous partner of Science Up First in Yukon. So take it away, Mathia, and let's give her a round of applause.
Hi, good evening, Dante. I was only given 5 minutes. I'm going to put a timer on. Like, and I will try not to talk super fast. So I'm going to tell a story about my community. So I come from the community. I belong to the Kluane First Nation. We're a small nation in the Yukon. So for those of you that don't know where the Yukon is, it is adjacent to Alaska, above British Columbia. We have a very small population. We are about 300 citizens, and we're self-governing. So that's a modern treaty holder. We have land claims and self-government agreement. We are along the Alaska Highway. The highway was built in 1942, so it had brought dramatic change to our community. We are also right next to the Kluane National Park. I don't know if any of you have heard of that. We're also right next to Kluane Lake. So I thought I'd wow you with all these photos. It's quite stunning. We have the largest non-polar glacial ice fields in the world. This is the Donjek Glacier there. We have the largest mountain in Canada, Mount Logan. We also have the impacts of climate change are very dramatic in our community. So we have what has been described as river piracy with the receding glacier. The Slims River, or Ayachu, has diverted from going into the Atlantic Ocean. Sorry, not the Atlantic, the ocean in the north, just escaped me. God, to the Pacific. And that was a big dramatic change for our lake. It dropped our lake levels by 6 feet, 6 to 10 feet, and it's still receding. So we're feeling the impact of climate change. We have a huge array of challenges in our area. We're also rich in copper, nickel, platinum, palladium. And if you know, your phones all work off of platinum, palladium. Very, very important. So that is like a description of where we are, who we are. We are a group of Southern Shoshone and Tlingit Nation. We're matrilineal. We're very connected to land. And with the highway coming through, we've only experienced contact with outsiders for about 2 generations. And only about 2 generations went to residential school. So this person in the right, on the bottom right, in the center in the purple jacket, that's my grandma. She's 94, and she didn't go to residential school, but my mom did. So there is, I come from a long line of really powerful women. When you look at matriarch societies, there is that calling of stand up, you lead with humility, and you lead for the interest of the nation. So I had the privilege of being the chief of Kluane First Nation from about 2010 to 2016. And when you look at what was happening at the time, we had this huge gold rush. There was a lot of things going on. We had the largest staking since the 1898 gold rush, largest staking claims. There was helicopters flying over every day. It was disturbing the sheep populations. We had the river piracy thing. So it was one thing after another. And we had realized that we really wanted to tell the story of our nation. And we had so much research going on. We had the Arctic Institute of North America in our backyard. They have a campus at the end of Kluane Lake. We had food security, washouts from the roads. So we had 4 or 5 days where no trucks could get through. People were boating food down to the other end of the lake. There was a lot of things happening. So what we did was look at all of these things, energy self-sufficiency, food security, glaciology, mineralization, and we looked at partners and we engaged community on all kinds of research. And you can see the grandmas in the corner talking about the research that is being done and really that engagement of community. The other big thing that we did was engage the youth. We wanted to give them the tools. We wanted to start them young. We looked to the partners and we built the expectation with our partners that they would create opportunities for our youth to be in the lab, to be in the field, to share the information back, and to share the information with the elders in the community so that the community could then share that information back. The premise being that we wanted to build up enough confidence in our youth that they were strong enough to play with the big boys. You can see she had no problem playing with the big boys there with the rugby ball. So that piece about building community and building partnership really comes to the fact that how do you communicate? You really want to be a part of the community. You need to be able to look at intergenerational sharing. You need to approach it from a humble perspective of, I have knowledge to share that's scientific, but you have intergenerational knowledge or traditional knowledge of land, of people, of heritage. You've lived in this territory for multi-generations, and we always say from time immemorial. And there's a lot of wisdom that comes with that. And a lot of that scientific wisdom is just as important. One of the big things is integrate fun into research. It is so important to have fun. And I think we've all said that. One of the things that came out of all of that interaction and building community was around creating some rules. So Kluane First Nation created rules for how we wanted research to be done in our communities. And this really is an opportunity for you to do your research. Don't rely on Indigenous peoples to teach you about their history, to educate you. Come in with a little bit of background. Try saying some words in a language. Know the community that you're going into, and some of the barriers that they may be experiencing around connectivity, around intergenerational trauma. How many years? On the East Coast, people went to residential school many, many generations, and it depends on where you're going to do your research. Do they have rules? The ones in the center are the Dene laws. Those are from some of the Athabascan in the NWT in northern British Columbia. And then the one on the right is the Tlingit way of life. And there's these types of rules in every Indigenous community. Look for it. So how are you bringing your research home? How are you connecting community? And that wasn't the formal question. The formal question is, how will you work? How will your work be inclusive of community from initiation to sharing final findings? Thank you.
Thank you. I love that image of grandmas talking about science. That's going to stick in my brain, and I love it. Next, we are going to be hearing from Dr. Krishana Sankar, who is the Science Advisor and Community Partnerships Lead at Science Up First. So thank you, Dr. Sankar. Yeah, clap.
Awesome. Good evening, everyone. Are you awake? Are you invigorated? All right, let's all stand up. Stand up for 1 second with me, please. Just stand up if you're able. Stand up with me. A little bit of a stretch. Arms up, of course, if you're able. Arms down. Arms to the side. What do you think I'm going to say now? Up, down, down. And then, like Moya said, now hug yourself. Awesome. All right, take your seats. So thank you, Moya. So I'm Krishana. I'm the in-house science advisor for an initiative called Science Up First, which is actually housed under the Canadian Association of Science Centers. And one of my main roles within this organization and this initiative is actually our community partnerships lead or community engagement lead. And so as a scientist, I was extremely honored and privileged to be able to do this type of work. So bringing my science, but also the humility and, you know, my own intersections into the type of work that I'm doing. Oops. Okay, I might need a little bit of help here. There we go. All right, so just to wrap everything up that was said by my phenomenal fellow panelists who were each bringing to you some of the struggles, some of the barriers, some of the information, quite frankly, that a lot of us need when we're thinking about how we're going to interact with different equity-deserving communities. So I'm here to sort of wrap that all up for you, right? So, I mean, as you can see, I am a brown person, you know, if you're able to. I'm a brown person. I'm an immigrant settler. I come from South America, a little country on the shoulder of South America called Guyana. And I am part of one of those equity-deserving communities, but I'm also coming at it as a third party, if you will, partner. So in my role, we do a lot of partnering with other equity-deserving communities and influencers as well as leaders from those communities. So I wanted to share a little bit with you about Science Up First. So here you'll see a little bit of infographic with some of the things that we've been able to accomplish since we launched, and we launched in 2021. So Science Up First was actually launched during the pandemic, and that was because of a lot of lack or gaps of knowledge or information that was actually occurring during that time, right? So, you know, whether you're in the room or you have family members, relatives, or friends who belong to certain equity-deserving communities who just weren't getting the information they needed during that time. That was one of our main goals or focuses, was to basically bring that scientific information in a way that people can access it. And so when I say access it and remove barriers, one example is language. And when I say language, I don't just mean whether it was English or a South Asian language or an African language. I mean also being able to break down that scientific jargon into understandable everyday language, right? So that is one important aspect of it. The other, of course, is being culturally relevant. And I have an example of that, and I'll chat about that. I don't know if one of our community members is in the room tonight. Lotus STEM is another one of our partners, as well as, Ainsley, I think I almost tripped too. So also Ainsley is another one of our partners. So you'll notice a trend, right? We tend to work with people from those communities who have those expertise, because we ourselves may not have those expertise when needing to or wanting to work with those communities, right? So I had this up for a while. Like I said, we were launched in 2021. You know, we're proud of these accomplishments. You know, we've managed to reach over 2,000 plus people in different equity deserving communities. We did this through various projects, and we've built partnerships and relationships. But my reason for even bringing this up is why and how. And one thing actually I did want to do is poll the room, and I'm not sure if this was done before, but show of hands who in the room are actually in or from an academic institution. All right, who is from a community setting or part of a community organization, perhaps serving an equity deserving community? Anyone in here? Okay, we've got a few. All right, any science communicators? Right, so some intersectionality there, right? I'm seeing some Venn diagrams happening. Awesome. So all of this information is important because now what I want to talk to you about is how we're going to, these are some of the ways that at Science Up First, we've managed to help to create and nurture trusting relationships. And so Mathea, the speaker just before me, beautiful pictures, by the way, one thing that she really hit home was trust. Right? So that was one of the things that was mentioned. And trust is extremely important when doing the type of work that we want to do. If we want to reach into communities, we want to be able to come in and help support what's happening already, right? We need to have trusting relationships that are either are already there, so hopefully they've already been established, or we're trying to establish those trusting relationships ourselves. So these are 3 points, of course, definitely not limited to these 3, but 3 important points that I wanted to bring up in the short time that we had to chat. So firstly, nothing for us without us. I'm sure some of you in here probably have heard this phrase before, and if not, here it is, nothing, for us without us. What does that mean? I think that one is pretty self-explanatory. So one of the things that I notice a lot of us tend to do when we want to work with community groups is, we want to kind of ride in on that white horse and say, oh, we've got some funding. We want to, help you do something. And we want to align with the funding that we have and the requirements that we have to meet and the outcomes that we have to meet. Well, immediately, red flag, right? Because in our work, community needs should be at the core of the work. And that's not to say that we are not looking to ensure that what we do and the outcomes we have are not aligning with the funding. But what's more important is that we ensure that the work that we want to do with our community partners is actually what they want to do, what they need to do, right? So ensuring that they're actually there at the planning. They need to be present at the table from the very beginning, at the very onset of projects. Many times, countless times, people do work, we're going in, we're saying, okay, we want to work with the community. But we already have a framework of the project, and we bring the community members on 6 months into the project. Now, there's so many issues with that because we have not actually designed these projects with those community members at the table. These are the people who need to be at the table, right? So it's, for example, myself coming in to work with Matea. I'm sure she's not going to appreciate it if I say, hey, Matea, we have this project. And we're 6 months in, and this is what the project looks like. But, you had no say into the design of this project, right? That is very disrespectful, right? And how are we going to be able to build that trust with our community partners if we are doing that? So they need to be at the table from the get-go. Second point, each community is unique, and therefore collaboration should be tailored accordingly. Of course, that's an extension of what I was talking about, but something else that they mentioned that I will elaborate on. So for example, in the examples that she mentioned, her grandmother did not go to those residential schools, but her mother did. In certain Indigenous communities, a certain generation might have gone to residential schools, whereas in others, it's very different. And so we need to look at each community and give them the respect they deserve according to what's happening in that community. Of course, the only way we can know that is if we have those conversations with them from the very beginning. It's not a point here, but something that has resonated with me and has come up several times is about communication and having those consultative chats and discussions with our partners, right? A lot of times, if we want to go in, we want to have a lot of chatting, we want to tell them what we want to do. Where is the listening? Communication, a lot of communication is actually listening to what it is that our partners' needs are, right? So that is extremely important. That's the only way we can know how to tailor our collaborations and our partnerships. I'll give you a couple examples. So one example, like I mentioned, the partner, I don't think she's in the room tonight, but Lotus STEM. So at Science Up First, we are creating scientific posts in an easy to understand manner, and it's on social media platforms. Now, mind you, not everyone's on social media, but we chose that platform because of the reach involved, especially during the time of COVID. So in one of our partnerships, we do something called a translation liaison model, where we have funding and we're able to work with our partner so that they're able to take content from Science Up First and use it, translate it, but not just language, but also cultural relevance, and share it back with their community. Now, in sifting through our content, we had this really cool example of how science and research is like a puzzle. And each time a scientist or a research community finds a small piece of data, it fits into the larger picture. Now, as much as that analogy was very cool and reached a lot of people, we were told by our partner that actually serves the South Asian community that that actually didn't resonate too well. And that's because they don't typically look to puzzles in that way. And that was the feedback we got. And so we also allowed them to take that content and use it, modify it into whatever way made the most appropriate cultural sense. So there's an example for you. And then thirdly, and again, Matea hit this one on the nail on the head for this one, the burden of learning about a community rests with us. It does not rest with that community. So for example, if you're hoping to work with the community, again, it is quite disrespectful to go in hoping that they can educate you. Now we're again putting burden on that community instead of us going in with some amount of knowledge. And there are resources for us to gain that knowledge before we even start the discussions and the collaborations with these community partners. So I think that's my time. But with that, I'll leave you with a challenge question. So in your own work, I want you to reflect on the effectiveness of your current relationship building strategies. What are you doing? How are you doing it with your different community partners? And then also, how do you know that your strategies are effective? How are you actually evaluating this? Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to all of the panelists. Thank you for sharing your work. I'm excited to hear the questions that you have for our panelists. But first, you have the chance to respond to the questions that they've asked you. So for the next 15 minutes, everyone has the opportunity to reflect on one of these challenge questions. Everyone here in the room, you have been assigned a question. Look at the little placard on your table to tell you which question you're responding to. People online, please do not be concerned if you don't hear any noise from us for about 15 minutes because we're doing a reflective exercise. So we'll be back in about 15 minutes and then we'll look over your responses. So please do some reflecting.
Hello? Yes, sorry, to clarify, check the link, and the questions are all on the side panel. Question 1, 2, 3, to 4, and it's on the heading, and then you can submit anonymously your questions. Feel free to discuss at your table or just think about it on your own.
submit your answers to Slido at the link here or at that QR code. And we're going to go through these questions one by one, starting with Carrie's question. How do we facilitate a safe environment and inclusive space for learning / discovery? This was question 1, and according to my very helpful handout, that tells me that people over there on that side of the room, do they have it backwards? Sorry, stage versus house directions, my bad. People over here on this side of the room, you were discussing this question, number 1. How did it go? How are you feeling about it? It's just some nods. All right, great. Well, so Carrie, your question was, how do we facilitate a safe environment and an inclusive space? How were you hoping people would respond to this question?
I was hoping folks would come at us with specific community groups in mind. Will you all panic if I run over with a microphone? Would you be interested in sharing any of your discussion, or is that like the worst idea in the world? Yeah? Okay.
I'm coming for you. Over here. All right.
Thank you. We didn't actually pin it down to the different specific groups, but we said that we could create this safe environment, first of all, if there was acceptance of differences. Secondly, that teachers should be representing the diversity. Thirdly, the contextualizing the information. And fourth, knowing who the group is and their, lost the end of that sentence. Well, knowing who the group is and their background would all help to create a safe environment.
I love that. Yeah. So, kind of platforming role models. Sort of when you talk about teachers, whoever we're having leading presentations or discussions in that space is really, really critical. And I guess that, I'm just digesting what you said. The kind of rules or guidelines is really important as well. When we organize Science is a Drag events, as part of the registration, we're very clear on what we try to be very clear about what this event is and who specifically the intended audience is. But when we kick off each show, some of the team kind of get up on stage and really set the tone. We have a very experienced drag queen is our MC for our events, and she just does such a great job at setting kind of expectations. A lot of people coming to this space, if they're coming from science environment, but they haven't necessarily been in a lot of queer spaces, don't necessarily know about things like tipping etiquette and things like that at drag shows. So we kind of have to share that information in advance. We share it at the start of the show, and then we ourselves, as organizers, kind of get up and interact with our performers and try to set the scene and the tone there. But yeah, there are a whole bunch of different really interesting ways you can think about fostering safe spaces. And yeah, role models is definitely one of them.
Absolutely.
Ramble. So
If you can't see it, how do you know that you can be it?
Indeed.
Like that's a good rule of thumb. Do we have any other responses here? Yes, we do. Let me read through these real quick. Okay. I'm loving seeing that we have to accept our differences, teachers representing diversity. But from the panel, I'd love to hear a bit about, accepting differences, but also maybe the tensions that you've seen arise because of differences and how to work through those in these spaces. Is that too much to ask?
I don't know. I mean, I can chime in from Science is a Drag.
How does Science is a Drag do it?
So we've been really fortunate thus far at shows and conferences where we've presented this. Conferences are a little different, but generally people just avoid eye contact rather than, say particularly harmful things to your face. What's been interesting in organizing and promoting the initiative, though, is that I do quite often get I don't know how to say this fairly. I get a few emails that come in that I don't think are written in good faith. questioning why we're doing this show, why it's important, what RCI Science's stance is on gender, and so on and so forth, which is not actually the point of the show. So I've had a few challenging things like that, a few challenging kind of tweets and things.
Yeah.
But I think that's really an indication that you're making it. When enough people are hearing about you, that they then, have something to complain about. I take it as a good sign as much as I can. Depends on what else is going on that day, of course.
That's a good positive spin.
Yeah, but yeah, so far so good. We'll see what happens as we keep kind of growing and spreading the word. And yeah, how the political climate keeps evolving in the next little while.
As it should.
Yeah, but I think scientists have a really important role to play here. I mean, we're so often leaders in society. We're so often trusted voices that we do have a responsibility to kind of stand up and speak for these communities, which are a part of science, and kind of hold the front line there. That's an attitude that I take anyway.
Thank you for doing that. Yeah. I would like to move on to question number 2 to make sure we have time to respond to Ainsley's challenge question. So this was, how will your work be inclusive of community from initiation to sharing final findings? That's question 3? Oh, my bad. Thank you. Ainsley's actual question is, what are your assumptions about how science is done and who can be a scientist? I'm going to quickly read through these responses and scroll through so everyone can see them. But I see, treat those who question science with respect. Unconscious biases influence who is chosen, so just be aware of that. And a long one about equity serving communities, having historically very few role models and trailblazers for people to go after. Ainsley, any of those 3 really resonate with you right now that you'd like to touch on first? Or I can ask something more specific.
Just give me a second to digest.
Yes, of course.
Sorry. Talk amongst yourself for a minute.
Yeah, actually, I would love to ask you a specific question about when you encounter people and you don't know about their ability status, what would be like the politest way to figure out how you can show up for them?
So I'm going to start this off. That's a great question. Thank you for asking it. By just saying that people's lived experiences matter. In, I think, I don't know, the 60s, maybe the 70s, we had this thing, sometimes we like to call color blindness, and this isn't necessarily about accessibility, but it's like, I can't see your color. I don't care what color you are. And when I was training as a student, I had someone who was supervising one of my placements at a hospital here in downtown Toronto. It was kind of like, I don't care if you have a disability, you're just like everyone else. And that's not true, actually. I am different. I do have a disability and it does matter. And if someone is, the color of their skin does matter as well. And when I'm teaching audio description in science spaces, we actually teach people you need to voice the color of the people's skin in the images you're showing, because it does matter. And if you don't, people who have print-based disabilities, not limited to, but including sight loss, they can't know if racism is happening unless you tell them what color is the image on the screen or the person that they're sitting with. So it does matter to talk about lived experiences. We had, I had somebody who was kind of a boss of mine in a hospital not in Toronto, in Canada, who was kind of like, oh, we can't talk about sexuality at work. But actually, if you're forcing people to hide their pronouns, if they're not what people might expect, then you're forcing them to sort of live a lie. And that's a lot of stress to live under. So we have to bring ourselves to our science spaces and the other science spaces that we occupy. And I think it's okay. We have to get comfortable asking questions that we've been taught that are uncomfortable, that you don't ask people. And the worst they can say is, oh, I don't want to share that, or I don't want to talk about that. But if you don't ask, you'll never know. And by building trust, you are able to increase the probability that people will respond to you and open up about what they need. But the other part of that is when someone experiences a microaggression, and this is where it's really sometimes can be some significant work to unlearn some of the things that you take for granted and be able to pick out microaggressions. If you're a leader in a space or you're a colleague and you witness a microaggression, you don't stand up and witness it and check in with the person who experienced it and also, do something about it, especially if you're the leader, then that's going to create an environment where it's not safe for people to be who they are. And that's where you're not going to be able to ask and get any responses. So when stuff does come up, you need to take the opportunity to do the hard things and follow it up. Accessibility is uncomfortable, and equity, diversity, and inclusion work is also really uncomfortable work for everybody. And so I think that discomfort is okay, and it does take practice to sit and be okay with that discomfort that shows up.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Yeah, let's all be a little uncomfortable for a second. And I'm going to ask you a question related to Ainsley's. Have any of you ever met a scientist or seen a scientist presented in the media and been surprised that that person was a scientist? If you are brave enough to raise your hand. No. Okay. Yeah. Absolutely. I know that I have been, whether I had never met that person before and I had seen them on social media, so I expected that they didn't have very serious pursuits. That's on me. I'm showing my biases here, but I have been surprised. And have you ever come across someone being surprised that you are a scientist, Ainsley?
Yeah. So when I tell people about some of the things that disabilities I have, I think people are generally surprised. So I'm deaf. I have a cochlear implant. It's bright purple and it's really great. You can't often see it though because it's a dark color and my hair is a little bit longer. But I've also, had a brain tumor and had brain surgery, and I tell people that and their mouths kind of drop over and they fall over. And I'm like, okay, it's okay. It happened to me, not you. You're going to be fine. So there's a lot of stigma, and there's in fact a hierarchy within the disability community of certain disabilities being stigmatized more than others, particularly in science spaces. So yeah, I've definitely experienced people being a little bit shocked to work with me and figure out that I have accessibility needs in the science spaces that I work in.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm in fact high functioning, which is by itself enabled this term.
Absolutely.
The Canadian National Institute for the Blind, the research team, and there's actually 65 to 70% researchers with disabilities, and we mentor a lot of students that don't have disabilities. So it's a really interesting reverse type of mentorship where students come to us and they learn a lot about accessibility just by doing research with us. So it's very cool.
That's amazing. Can I pose the same question to other people on the panel by show of hands? Has anyone ever been surprised to learn that you are a scientist? Yeah, I get that all the time. All right, let's move on to Matthia's challenge question. I have the right one this time, right? Number 3, awesome. How will your work be inclusive of community from initiation to sharing final findings? I'm going to do this a different way. Would anyone like to share their response? Question 3 was somewhere over here in this part of the room, right? I see someone in the back raising their hand. Celia's coming to you with a microphone. But we can also read some of the responses on the screen if we can.
Would you like to? Or
Anyone? No, I made up a hand. I'm sorry. So I will read some answers from the screen. One way that you can be inclusive is to ask what they want to learn and how they want to learn. Is this something that you've used in your practice, panelists? Yes. Yeah. Okay, cool. Mathia, feel free to respond to any of these as I go through them. And the next response, include the community from initiation of ideas. Great. And during each step of the process. Awesome. Yeah, I think that Mathia and Krishana both touched on this for sure.
actually, we do have one response back here.
Awesome.
Okay, decided I should be a little bit vulnerable here and share. So I work at Environment Canada, so one of the funders for you guys. Environment Canada with the Environmental Learning and Citizenship team. So it's a new team that we're growing and we're trying to expand and influence environmental education and all that great stuff because, yep, we've worked with you guys. And what we were talking about, or what I explained at the table here, is that inclusion element is something that we're always having to stop and check in with ourselves as well, right? It's very easy in government to say, this is the direction we want to go in, and just do it and put it out there and say, yeah, we thought we were right because we had the best scientists, the best stakeholders, et cetera, give us insight. However, right now we're in the process of, we're navigating our path, and we've taken a step to say, stop, let's do a discussion paper. And we're in the process, literally, that's what I have to do in the morning, edit the discussion paper, and we're going to put it out there, and that's about public consultation. And then on top of putting out a discussion paper, understanding different needs and abilities, we're going to do actual engagement sessions with different groups, because we understand not just, well, at least I understand it, and I share with my colleagues, that you can't just engage everyone together and think that the discussion, have one discussion and think everyone has the same needs and you need to engage them the same way. So we'll have a discussion with open for the Indigenous community, another discussion for BIPOC communities, another discussion for youth, and just ensuring that, we're not trying to just get to the end result and thinking we know everything, but really engaging the public to make sure the steps we're taking align with the needs of the public.
I want to maybe just add a couple of things to that, because I think that is amazing. Like looking at a community and determining what kind of needs you can fill. I'd almost like to take a step back, and before you even initiate your research project, take a look at, is that a priority for the nation that and this is from a rural, remote, Indigenous community. And a lot of the work that gets done in research in Canada, whether that's through Environment Canada, NRCan, Health Canada, it's done in rural and remote communities. I know everybody thinks Toronto is the center of the world, but it's not. Do they?
Says the New Yorker.
Yes. But really, the communities are going through a lot. And is it a priority that they can turn their energy towards and actually assist you with your project? Do they have the resources to participate meaningfully? There's this piece that I see all the time, and it drives me insane, is this part where researchers or government folk go out and say, we did engagement. We went to that one meeting, we shared some information, and there were people who asked questions. So that was engagement. I'm like, no, that was not. That was information sharing. If you want engagement or collaborative work, you actually have to sit down, listen to what is being said, and absorb that and reflect that in the work that you're going to put forward, or be willing to say, not at this time. This is not appropriate at this time. So I think there's that piece. And then one of the things that I see a lot because I don't just work in First Nation community, I work throughout the Yukon, and I worked in COVID, throughout COVID, as the First Nation liaison for the 14 First Nations, the federal government, the territorial government. There's this piece about inclusion versus almost pandering. So know that distinction. Are you trying to include people, or are you just saying you want to include them? Because there's a big difference. And it comes through loud and clear when you show up in the community and you're only going there to check a box. It is absolutely, and you lose trust, you lose respect if you're not actually being authentic and showing up in a way that is respectful.
Thank you. I also want to point out another response to this that I have found to be really important in my work, which is acknowledging the privilege that you have. I can't remember her name. Maybe I want to say Peggy Whitson, but that's an astronaut. This woman who gave a talk about your knapsack of privilege and how everyone has some privileges. My first language is English. I was born in the US. I recognize that these are privileges that I have, and I make sure that I acknowledge them in every space that I enter, because it's important to acknowledge those dynamics. But let's move on to question number 4. We have Dr. Sankar's question, which is it's less of a question and more of a command, maybe, to reflect on the effectiveness of your current relationship building strategies with community partners. So after having done that reflection, how are you evaluating whether or not your approach is effective? So let's take a moment to go through these responses. Active communication with community partners. I evaluate the effectiveness relationship building strategies in the workplace by seeking regular feedback from peers. Yes, peer feedback, very important. Also inviting evaluation groups from communities to review the projects in various stages of the project. That's great. Dr. Sankar, is there any other way of evaluating that you would like to see here on this list?
I just gotta say, it was not a demand. I just wanted you to reflect before you could answer the question.
An invitation to reflect.
Yes, I love that. I love all 3 responses here. I think even at CASC, so the Canadian Association of Science Centers, where I work under the Science Up First initiative, we do these as well. So there's feedback surveys. I particularly like reviewing the projects during different stages as you go along. I think that's really important. Of course, there are things like focus groups, listening circles, if listening circles is what that community does. And of course, this has to be done, that is done within that community. And then sharing that information back, of course, there's a lot of permissions and that need to go along with that. So you have to check in with that community. I think one thing that I learned in particular in my role, and I think is very important, is, again, even with the methods of feedback, what works for one community will not necessarily work for another. So you need to, again, have that conversation with the communities that you're working with to find out what is the best and most effective ways of getting information back from that community. And I think, and Mathea, you will have more expertise on this than I would, but again, how is that information being used outside of that community? That I know is another really important piece, and there are ethical implications for that as well. So yeah, things like, focus groups, feedback surveys being used, questionnaires, interviewing. So all of those are different methods. And I know there are a few academics in the audience. So, if you are in like the life sciences or the physical sciences, I would also say it would be great to partner with your social science peers, because when it comes to community work, they have a lot of these expertise, and that's been a bias of mine, right? Coming from the life sciences, sometimes you think, our methods that we use, are great. Yeah, they're great for, quantitative data collection, sure. And, very, very wrong, but this happens within academia, discounting our, social science peers and their qualitative methods. And so that actually has a lot to do with how we collect data and information when doing a lot of community engagement work. So I'll just put that out there for something, for you to think about if you haven't quite done that yet.
The folklorist in me doubles down on that hard. Yes, please engage the social scientists in your lives and in your collaborations. Awesome. Thank you so much for your responses. Thank you so much for reflecting on these different questions. If you didn't have the chance, I know you were assigned to one question, so you have now heard and seen all of the questions. I encourage you to reflect on those later as well. But now we have some time for you to ask questions of our wonderful panelists. So would anyone in the audience like to ask the panel a question here? Thank you.
There was a recent essay written by Steven Pinker trying to reconcile the humanities with the sciences. And there was a response from Ian McGilchrist. I don't know if you've read either of those. It's worth a read. What's my point in saying that? Science can be viewed as authoritarianism, unless it kind of positions itself with a greater understanding of the humanities. Pinker's essay basically was focused on the humanities needing to understand the sciences. McGilchrist's essay in response was to say, if you want to have a marriage couple work out, you have to hear stories from both sides. And at that point, you're actually talking to both sides of your brain at the same time. I think if you're only listening to the facts, the abstractions of science, then you're not going to get there. I want to leave you with a visual idea, which is the possible, the probable, and the actual form a triangle. In the middle is fact or fiction. It could be anything. It could be probable, it could be possible, it could be actual. But you don't know. Could be improbable. Could be apparently impossible, but this is the reality. The reality is the totality of things. It's not the individual facts. You know this probably from philosophical stuff. That's all I'm going to say.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that, would anyone here on the panel disagree with the benefit of working with both?
No, I actually want to say it's a great point, and I'll probably take it maybe slightly on a tangent. And I know a lot of us, especially as science communicators, one of the things that we try to do is we try to bring the human aspect to science. So, with the point that you made, it's very true. And I think that's what we were all on the panel trying to do, is to say, okay, yeah, I guess bringing it, and thank you for bringing it back to, are the facts enough, right? So what are the different strategies that we can use? So in particular, I know I was talking about partnering with community partners, but even so, when we are communicating with our partners, we should be bringing the human side to it. And science is never done in a vacuum, as we've all discussed here, right? So there is the human part to science. There are mistakes that happen in science. And I think it's very important that we also acknowledge that. And we also talk about the scientific process, because it's human beings who are doing science. So thank you for that. And yes, again, and I think Moya might have mentioned this earlier too, even when we talk about communicating science, facts are one thing, but we actually know, like research has shown, that people tend to digest stories even better than numbers. So that's something, that's another little tidbit. And also what science communicators strive to do a lot when we are communicating science to the non-expert public is to bring the science, but in a more easily digestible way, which is usually through storytelling. So it's factual storytelling, if you will.
My favorite kind. That's not true. My favorite kind has fairies in it. We have a question that was submitted from someone online. I imagine it was directed towards Ainsley specifically, but I welcome input from other panelists as well. Do you have any recommended platforms to use to make websites more accessible? I think they're looking for specific plugin softwares or platforms that you could recommend. Or if you don't know them specifically, where should people go to learn these best practices?
Thank you very much for the question. So I'm going to start by saying don't use a plugin or an accessibility overlay. They're not the same thing, but they are related. There's very few plugins I've seen that can actually render a site accessible. An accessibility overlay is something I'm not a tech expert, but something you would apply to your website that's supposed to make it accessible. There's a bunch of problems. Long story short, they don't work. And a lot of the big companies that employ accessibility overlays can afford to pay for the lawsuits that they may get. But they actually don't work. So don't do that. There is one plugin we found recently that is actually pretty good. We couldn't find any accessibility issues with it. We were really trying hard, but we couldn't. So I'm not sure if anyone in the audience can think of the name of that one, but it is really hard to find a plugin or accessibility overlay that actually makes the site accessible. So you want to make sure you have somebody actually test the site with a screen reader, ideally in a screen magnifier, with browsers and different types of devices. So Apple devices, PCs, Android, VoiceOver on a Mac, different types of things. So accessibility testing can get quite fancy. There's a lot of different settings or conditions you might be testing. But yeah, please do avoid the accessibility overlays and the plugins as much as you can.
Thank you for that advice. Yeah, to test it yourself. We did that ourselves earlier before you got here. We were testing out the colors on our slides to make sure that they were visible and clearly distinguishable. So that's a good lesson. Thank you, Ainsley. Do we have any other? Oh, yeah.
I was going to say, or you can also hire IdeaSTEM, which Science Up First did, because they do phenomenal work.
Love that. Thank you, Christian.
Great, thank you. Do we have any questions from people here in the in-person audience? We have some other online ones. Yeah, we have one on the other side of the room. Thank you, Celia. Other people, we have time for a few more questions after this, so if you want to come up to this microphone up here to ask next, you can do that.
Hi, thanks for that.
Next. After.
Thanks for the panel, the speakers for coming here. I guess I'm a graduate student and also science communicator. And I think one of the issues sometimes I do face in academia is that science communication is not perceived as research productivity or scientific productivity. And I was wondering if you ever had to deal with this and how do you approach it? And it's open to everyone.
Yeah, I started my science communication business in my 4th year of grad school. I wrote a book while I was writing my dissertation, and I did not tell my dissertation committee about that. I did tell them about much of my SciComm work, and I think the way that I was able to do that was because I had an advisor. I chose an advisor ahead of time who was passionate about science communication himself. So I knew that he would respect my pursuits of SciComm, but it's not something you can do like retroactively. So any other advice?
Yeah, so
my beer.
I think a lot of us have been in your shoes, and it's unfortunate. I would like to think and hope that it's getting a little bit better as time goes on. And I say that because there are funding bodies. So, for example, CIHR, the Canadian Institute of Health Research, and other funding bodies that are slowly starting to actually have paid positions where science communicators come in. And I think, if nothing else, one thing that COVID has for sure taught a lot of people is the importance of having people with the scientific expertise be able to speak to the non-expert public. So I think the need for it was seen, is continuing to be seen. However, from an academic standpoint, unfortunately, I think a lot of professors will still not necessarily see it as productivity, because they'll see it as you taking time away from being at the bench or at the computer, wherever it is that you do your research. How I dealt with it is, I think, similar to Moya, except that I didn't know about science communication. Sort of became a thing here in Canada not that long ago, to be honest. So it was a thing we all were doing, but we didn't really have a name for it, if you will, right? We're always out there doing presentations or doing events, but there wasn't a name. I just did it on the side, right? So there was no discussion about what I was doing. I did it on the side because in my situation, I also knew that my supervisor might not have been supportive of it or seen it in a favorable light. And I think that's also why a lot of science communicators may have left academia, but yeah, right. So you do what you have to do for the time being, but my hope is it's going to slowly get better.
Hi.
Do you want to go, Mateo, first?
Yeah, I just want to do a quick make a point. The fact that you're finding it difficult from a research side. I'm not a scientist. I like politician, economic development. I'm in health right now. What the heck? But I'm coming from the side of community, trying to bring science to community and be that overlay on on the community side. And one of the challenges is the fact that academia doesn't recognize the expertise of community, or that traditional knowledge is scientific knowledge. The fact that Tri-Council funding does not allow for Indigenous communities to be recipients of those funds. So how are you going to include those voices when you're systemically creating barriers to those voices? To me, that is pandering. You say you want to include those voices, yet you create barriers to actually hearing them or being inclusive of them. Thanks.
Such a great point. Just to layer on the complexities in the context, I think one of the interesting questions to ask is who's doing science communication? And when we start to look around the room, it's a lot of women, a lot of people from equity deserving communities. And this isn't true of Canada. I mean, this is true all over. I'm from the UK originally, had the same problem there. And as Christiana was saying, sort of science communication was taking root in Canada, maybe 6-7 years ago, which is why I moved here to kind of play in that space. But there's still this real notion that public engagement, outreach, whatever term we want to use, is altruistic. It's a nice to have rather than a have to have. And it really is a have to have. It is essential for a functioning kind of democratic society. And we need to find a way to legitimize it more, I think. Part of that's through paid positions. Sometimes it's through certifications and things like that. I mean, that's so complex and muddy and a bit gatekeepy, but here we go. It's part of the conversation. And then I think one of the key things to keep in mind as well is building community within our own sort of science communication space, building and fostering networks in that space, and then working together to kind of influence policy change and things like that, so we can start to, enforce the changes we want to see. But it all takes time, unfortunately, and it's all very exhausting. But I do find that finding your kind of community where you can come and have a nice cathartic event is good, and then feel empowered and energized. Shannon and I have been in a couple of conversations recently, actually, a couple of the same Zoom calls, and I kind of leave them feeling a little bit more energized and optimistic about where things are going if we can just keep chipping away at it.
Thank you.
So I'm going to do another plug. SciCommTO hashtag is a community that Carrie is. You're running it right now, right? So Carrie is running that. So yeah, find your tribe, find your community. It makes a huge difference, and we are, like Carrie mentioned, slowly chipping away at it. But when you have that community support behind you, it makes a big difference.
Ainsley, do you have anything?
I would also love to just take a brief moment to chip in on this question. I'm hoping that we're going to see requirements for researchers change. They're very archaic right now. I'm not sure they're very effective. When people fill out ethics applications, they of course say, how are you going to involve the community, and how are you going to disseminate this information? And scientists disseminate often to journals that carry a lot of dust or just don't get clicked on very often in the electronic world. And that's who they disseminate it to. There's not often a lot of dissemination to the participants in the research, if it's human-facing research or the community that was involved in the research where it took place, whatever. And it is a skill. It is a skill to be able to create communications, not for academic journals and not even for government, although that's a skill by itself. But it's a skill to be able to communicate what you're doing and tell people about it. And I don't think academia values that skill very much, but I'm hoping that will change. I'm involved in a research project right now that will influence federal government research and hopefully start to make more strict requirements for research dissemination, and then participation in co-design of research by the communities that are impacted by that work, and to be part of it rather than just participating in it.
Thank you so much. We are out of time. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. Can we give them another round of applause, please? Thank you. I know. I'm so sorry to the people who didn't get to ask their questions, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I can't speak for everyone, but I'll be here for a little bit afterwards if you want to ask me a question, and maybe some others will be here too. But I think that over the last hour and a half, we have definitively answered the question, are facts enough? Audience, are facts enough? No. There you go. So thank you for sitting with us. Thank you for listening to our work. I want to thank the sponsor of this event and the hosts of this event, the Gairdner Foundation, RCI Science, Science Up First, and the sponsors TELUS Health, the Government of Canada, and Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and all of the panelists. Again, thank you so much. There is a survey that you can fill out to give your feedback to this workshop. Tell us if it was useful. That's another way of evaluating everything. And Celia here, rock star that she is going to give you a way to access that very soon. But thank you again for spending your Thursday night with us here. Submit your... so close. Tell us about your experience at that link and at that QR code, please. That's how they know if we should keep doing more events like this and what iterations we should make, because the point of science is to iterate until you get it as good as it can be. So thank you and good night.